Good evening, everyone. My name is Jody Allen, and I am the Robert Francis Eames Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 11th Annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium. Before we get started tonight, there are a couple statements I'd like to share with you. First, William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka, Nottoway, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, the Monacan, the Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, the Patawomic, the Upper Mattaponi, and the Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. Also, the Lemon Project stands with the rest of William and Mary in solidarity with our Asian Pacific Islander colleagues and students to say that anti-Asian hate is unacceptable and has no place at William and Mary. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Rowe, the 28th president of William and Mary. Dr. Rowe?
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Good evening, everybody. Dr. Allen, thank you for both of those statements to start us off, both really incredibly important of this moment and of many, many centuries here. It's really great to be with so many students and colleagues and scholars and distinguished guests. Today, as Dr. Allen says, we are launching the 11th Annual Lemon Project Symposium, 4 Centuries of Black Women in America, Freedom, Activism, and Justice for All. This discussion feels so timely right now. Our nation just inaugurated Kamala Harris as Vice President. It's really exciting to say that, building on the sustained work of so many activists over these centuries. At the same time, pandemic and systemic racism have illuminated profound equities in our society. So this week's programming lifts up the histories of Black women and their far-reaching contributions to the nation. William and Mary is delighted to host 3 extraordinary keynote speakers. Tonight, Christy Coleman, Executive Director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. In one of our last in-person events pre-pandemic, Dr. Coleman, William and Mary had the privilege to award you an honorary doctorate. It was an amazing time. And we're fortunate so much in your partnership and leadership in our region. For everyone here who hasn't heard Dr. Coleman's work before, she exemplifies one of my favorite mantras, spoken by Layli Maparian at Wellesley's Women's Center, that research plus leadership equals accelerated social change. Dr. Coleman is one of those powerful accelerators who can close the loop between research and public history in a way that has real impact. Later this week, Catherine Meeks, Director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, Kay Wise Whitehead, Associate Professor of Communication and African American Studies at Loyola University, Maryland, will speak. We're really looking forward to that. And we'll close out the symposium with a special performance event, a collaboration between the Lemon Project and the Committee on the Asian Centennial at William and Mary. Will call us into a year-long anniversary that we're just beginning. Our aim is to advance an international and multicultural vision for this university. This year's Lemon Project looks very different. Its reach is broad. Like so many other events this year, it's our first ever virtual version of this symposium. I want to thank the Lemon Project team and the symposium committee for bringing us here together. The creativity that they brought to preparing for this week builds on much more than a decade, really, of innovation at the Lemon Project. Across our campus, which you will see again, we hope next year, and beyond, the sustained research efforts of faculty and staff and students have advanced discovery and real change. Last month, we announced the Bray School Building Discovery and the work that we will be undertaking to understand the 400 or so students who were taught there from 1760 to 1774. In May, this May, we will break ground for William and Mary's Memorial to the Enslaved. These initiatives, these are just two of the amazing initiatives that are grounded in a decade of Lemon Project work. Nationally, as many of you know, the Lemon Project has blazed trails as a model for reconciliation and reckoning with institutional histories of slavery and discrimination. So I'm looking at this crowded virtual room thinking how much William and Mary owes a debt of gratitude to the faculty and staff and students who've led these efforts over more than a decade. I especially want to thank Robert Francis Eng's director of the Lemon Project, Dr. Jody Allen, for the deep and sustained work to expand the history of enslaved African Americans here and across our country, which is also the expansion of the history of our democracy. The Lemon Project is bending the arc of William and Mary towards justice. So I look forward to continuing to support and to elevate this marvelous work and to see it continue to accumulate and its impact over time and continue to bear fruit. Thank you. Back to you, Dr. Allen. You're muted.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You know, it's only been a year, maybe 2 years I'll remember to unmute myself on a regular basis. Anyway, what I was saying, thank you, Dr. Rowe, for being here and for your very kind words. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the evening, Dr. Christy Coleman. With a career spanning over 30 years, Christy Coleman has served as the Chief Executive Officer for some of the nation's most prominent museums. She's a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. Ms. Coleman is an innovator and leader in the museum field, having held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, the American Civil War Museum, and now as Executive Director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. She's written numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national news and history programs. Most recently, she served as historical consultant for the film Harriet and Showtime's Good Lord Bird miniseries. She's also been a featured public historian for several documentaries, most recently the acclaimed miniseries Grant. Dr. Coleman is a recipient of numerous awards, including honorary doctorates from William and Mary, VCU, and the University of the South for her decades of impact. In 2018, Time magazine named her one of the 31 people changing the South. And in 2019, Worth magazine named her one of 29 women changing the world. We are so lucky to have her with us today. And without further ado from me, I present to you Dr. Christy Coleman.
Thank you so much, Jody. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And you as well, Dr. Catherine Rowe. The partnership that we've been blessed to have with William and Mary has meant the world to me, in fact, in making this transition and working back in Williamsburg again. So I am absolutely delighted to be with everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. Needless to say, I was scrolling through our participants lists, and I see lots of colleagues and friends from the community that are here, as well as some amazing scholars that are participating in this conference for the Lemon Project Symposium. And again, I am just grateful for the opportunity to speak to you again, because I spoke, I think it was probably 3 years ago now, for as a keynote one evening, and it ended up being quite a lively event. And I have to say, even though we've done a number of these video conference Zoom type sessions now, I still wish I could see your face and wish I could still interact with you. But I will say this much: that the topic of this year's symposium, 400 Years of Black Women in America and Their Impact, is one that is near and dear to my heart. And over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, I will share with you and try to weave together the remarkable work and sessions that are being offered at this year's conference. At the end of that period, we'll have an opportunity for open Q&A, whether it's about something I shared with you or whether there are other questions about this strange mix of a world that we call public history, of which I am forever indebted to the work of academic historians that enable us to bring the richness and variety of our stories to the fore. So how do we get started? Well, like the conference today, the symposium today, we began with the general idea and a general understanding of women and slavery. And you heard from scholars that helped you understand slaveholding in Maryland and DC, particularly around the Jesuit priesthood that enslaved men, women, and children on plantation sites that funded some of this nation's most extraordinary academic institutions. And they talked to you about that. And I think more than anything else, the thing that strikes me most with sort of the lack of understanding in the general public is this understanding that this nation in fact was built off the labor of Black men and women. Wealth was built off the labor and the loins of Black men and women. And we begin to see this resistance pretty early on, but we know the name finally of the first African woman enslaved in Virginia, brought to Virginia in 1619, and she was called Angelo, an Angolan woman who likely had been the spoils of war and who was traversed across the Atlantic, stopping in the Caribbean, brought to Old Point Comfort, and finally brought here to Jamestown, where she would toil the soil for most of her life. Angelo, or Angela, as I prefer to call her, is in a way our Eve in this horrid story of exploitation over time. But she is also the story of our strength. As one colleague stated earlier this week, and I was so struck by it, as we think about our generational trauma, let's not forget the generational strength that we have been given to survive these 400 years, and not just survive, but to thrive, to make a way out of no way, to wade in the water, to go deeper and higher, higher and higher to a place where they did not want us to belong, to carve out spaces that are in fact our own. So as we think about that journey from Angelo to today, there are many women whose names we may never know. There are women whose names we know quite well. And then there are those who are in the cusp, those women, those ancestors that have pushed us forward to believe in more. A while ago, I'll share with you, a while ago, I wrote this poem because I was in a space. And I honestly have to tell you, I wrote this probably 30 years ago. And I found it recently as I was thinking about tonight's program. And I wrote this at the beginning of my career in museum work. Because when I started in museums, as some of you know, I started as what is referred to as a living history interpreter, meaning it was my job to embody the personalities, the work, the people of 18th century Williamsburg. That was my job. I was 17 years old, and so they gave me a 17-year-old girl by the name of Rebecca. And her story was tragic from the beginning. This was the story of a young girl whose owner was near death and her future uncertain. Would she be passed on to the estate of his daughter when she married, or would she be sold to pay debts? She had already been separated from her birth mother and had been placed in this household at the tender age of 4 years old to serve as playmate and maidservant to Anne Blair. That's the person I had to portray. I had to find her through the scant historical record. I had to find her in the environment that she lived. I had to find her within myself. And that summer, like I said, I sat down and I wrote this thing to myself, because you see, taking on that job, as important as it was to me and as important as it became more than just an acting job for me, it helped me see the pain of my community through her eyes as well. Colleagues that told me, classmates to be more correct, classmates that wanted to know how could their senior class president be playing a slave. Family members and church members who thought that I could and should be doing more than what I was doing. Insensitive visitors who thought it was appropriate to say the inappropriate to me as a 17-year-old girl portraying a 17-year-old girl. So what I wrote that summer, and by all means, I'm just asking for your indulgence, has stayed with me all these years. I never threw it out. And what I wrote was, Mammy died and no one seemed to care. Her breasts suckled those who would grow to call her out her name. Mammy died and no one seemed to care. Her calloused hands reached for babes stripped from her bosom, stripped from her womb. But Mammy died and no one seemed to care. Her feet were bloodied by the trodden path to those she'd lost. Mammy died and no one seemed to care. Her eyes dried out and turned brown from too many tears, from too many tears of loved ones ripped and children ripped and pains and stripes upon her back. Mammy died and no one seemed to care. Her lips blistered, desperate to quench the thirst of knowledge, to be seen in her fullness and her beauty. Mammy died and no one seemed to care except me. Again, that was 30 years ago. And back then there were very few museums outside of ethnic-specific African-American museums where you could even hear the stories of enslaved ancestors. And in fact, in many cases, we couldn't even hear those because we had been taught to be ashamed. We had been taught that somehow we had this survivor's guilt. We had been taught to push away that trauma that had passed from one generation to another. The stories that sustained us became the stories that shamed us. So I felt alone for much of that time. But I soon realized I wasn't. Because I soon learned not only about people like those first 20 and odd in 1619, but I learned about people like Elizabeth Key, who in 1656, well, she decides to sue for her freedom. And she is among the first to do that. She does it under the auspice of understanding that the man who claimed her mother as his property was in fact her father. And everybody knew it. And this is before the formalization of servitude for life for persons of African descent. This is before, but it is still practice. It is practiced even though it wasn't law. And her freedom was being stripped from her. Because you see, under the laws of primogeniture, for which the English crown and English subjects had lived under for a long time, i.e. the condition of the father that determines the condition of the child through property rights and the like, Elizabeth Key understood that she was a free woman and should be a free woman, free to make her way out of no way. Elizabeth Key went to court. And miraculously, Elizabeth Key wins her case. And in the course of winning her case, Elizabeth Key reveals through her push for what she knows is right, cracks in this evolving system. And shortly after Elizabeth Key's success in that court, two important laws will change. The first was brought about in 1664 that says the condition of the mother shall now determine the condition of the child when it comes to servants and slaves, and particularly for those enslaved. So we're going to solve this problem. We're going to shift it. And the claim is under Mosaic law, but it was really not. It only referred to the enslaved. The condition of the mother shall determine the condition of the child. And the second lie that puts its way forward was the idea that somehow these Africans who had to be Christianized at some point in this process, well, they changed the law for that too. And they say that baptism in 1667, that baptism of slaves doth not exempt them from bondage. Race-based slavery is making its way, and it is around this time as well that the English start making plans to import more and more Africans for their cash crop of tobacco. And the expanse of Virginia's wealth grows and grows until a little 7-year-old girl is brought to these shores, to Boston actually, because she's too scrawny to be sold in the Caribbean, and she's too scrawny for Virginia, so they take her to Boston. And she is sold for pittance because the slave ship's captain believes she's going to die. And the family that takes her in, the family that purchases this child, decide, well, she's a bit precocious. They name her Phyllis. They teach her to read and write. And she begins to express her feelings and her longings through the written word and poetry. You know these stories. But what is interesting about Phyllis, with the dozens of poems that we know about, and likely up to 250 more that she wrote, there was always someone trying to lift her and someone trying to pull her down, and to say that the genius of her mind was not genius at all, but rather some kind of trick, because we had become, as a nation, greatly entrenched, greatly enshrined in this idea already of the superiority of the English over the African, or the European over the African, despite evidence to the contrary. But Phyllis is also an example of how these Black women would have to negotiate their identities. And you will hear more about that. Actually, you heard some of that today. This idea of negotiating her identity, knowing full well, even if the law says that my child is not mine, I am still their mother. Negotiating, even though the law says that this man that I love with all my heart and soul is not my husband, he is still mine. Negotiating identities of womanhood and every facet thereof, even though the law has been written and changed to say that Black women are now taxable, tithable. They are working people. They are people for whom wealth is gained, and therefore they must be taxed, leaving only white women as the untithables, negotiating identity. As time would move on, we would find women of courage beyond our understanding. Women who, again, were not afraid to wade in the water. These women who would risk life and limb for themselves and their children by escaping slavery's harsh hand. The historical record is full of runaway ads that tell us everybody from Suki to Iona to Sally to Becca to Rachel. Names we've read time and time again in these runaway ads passed on. These women seeking that grain, that moment where they can just be, where they aren't having to navigate their lives and their work and their children, where they are able to find some respite. And most who run away, especially in the late 17th and 18th century, are simply running away for peace. They are running to loved ones taken from them, because you see, all 13 of the colonies were slaveholding. To the south were the Spanish, who had been bringing Africans to these shores from the 1560s and 70s. To the west, the French were also bringing slaves in and around through Canada, while also doing unspeakable and unimaginable things among the indigenous peoples. And into the south, the French into Louisiana and the like. But these Black women just wanting peace. They organized themselves in ways we can't imagine. They organized themselves for mutual care and understanding. They organized themselves so that their children could be cared for, even if they were taken away. Aunties and uncles, whether blood or not, that raised these babies up. These women would continue to do this work. And those who would find freedom in the midst of the land of slavery, well, they organized anti-slavery societies and beneficial societies to aid their brothers and sisters still bound in border South. These women and their societies covertly raising money, speaking out, hiding people, doing whatever they could, forming coalitions to bring about freedom and to destroy this paradox of freedom. You have women later like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whom Sister Melba Boyd has written quite a bit about, but she is fighting not only for vote, but for full citizenship. She is fighting for womanhood in a way that will lead her all the way through the rest of her life into the 20th century. She is working and organizing. As are the stories that we've heard before about Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman, to even have to spout those words, to be heard and understood, to find empathy. This is the journey of Black women. To ask others to have empathy to our experiences. The fight for civil rights did not just begin in the 20th century. It began long ago. The right to be seen, the right to be heard, the right to learn, the right to choose. Even the most basic thing as what your child's name will be. What skill or trade or education they will receive. all stripped away basic human and civil rights. But they kept fighting and they kept organizing. And some created, like Phyllis, like actually Frances Harper was also a poet, writing their thoughts, sharing those thoughts, trying to reach a world that refused to see them for all the glory that they were. And as we moved into the 20th century, we began to see more of this art take shape. Whether it was extraordinary artists like those that have been mentioned before, women like, well, Margaret Burroughs or Elizabeth Catlett, that took our history and our stories and created masterworks. They created music and song and dance, to find joy in moments of sadness, to create genius in the moments of pain and joy. Our rhythm, our blues, our jazz, our pop, our hip hop, and our rap, to say who we are and to see us for all that we are. But as we think through who these women are and what they've done and what they've sacrificed along the way, we cannot forget all of those who come before them. We talk about Black Lives Matter and seeing the faces of the mothers begging for justice for Tamir Rice, begging for justice when you know that you may not find it. And before them, there was Mamie Till, who had the courage to let the world see what had been done to her 14-year-old child in Mississippi. She wasn't the first to see her child lynched and murdered and defiled that way. And regrettably, she will not be the last, unless we continue this march. So how do we find these stories? How do we find these resources? As I tell my colleagues in the museum space, the stories have always been there. The research and the scholarship and the sources, they are there. We just haven't been looking in the right places. And the fact that scholars are now looking to complete the American narrative in a way that we can actually make it useful and functional is a beautiful thing. So when I see stories about slavery databases coming out of the Library of Virginia, or coming out of the Gilder Lehrman Center, or coming out of Yale, or the Lemon Project, that are adding to our understanding, bringing together all disciplines of academic scholarship, I am encouraged, because I know that I can bring that work to this work in museums. The adage that history, we have to know our history so we can learn from it and not repeat the mistakes of the past. Well, I can tell you we have been repeating the mistakes of the past because we haven't corrected the narrative. But the time has come. And I am seeing more and more of our institutions opening that up, because you see, history has never been for the dead. It is for the living. It is for the breathing. It is for us to be able to look back with sharp focus so that we can chart a path forward. And when we do this work, we can't help but see the extraordinary work of Black women. From the suffragettes who pushed for the vote back in the 1850s, but would not receive that vote until the 1960s, even as white women gained it in 1920. The stories that were passed on to me about my grandmother in Florida getting dressed up on voting day and putting on her gloves to go down to the polls in Florida and to be turned away until she wasn't. But she kept going year after year. You see, there is a persistence. There is a persistence that pushes on our collective conscience. There is a persistence that enables us, when we open up wide enough to see, that the promise of America and the debts that are owed have always been brought forth, in large measure, by Black women, who either push the men in their lives or the men in power or the women with access to men in power to see us, to embrace us. Because the statistics don't tell you all. And Lord knows we all get tired sometime. But somehow we have created this image of Black women in our consciousness that we don't get weary, we don't get tired, we don't get beat down. Because there is an inner strength there. There is. But the mantle is passed from one generation to the next to do this work. It has to be. It has to be. So as I reflected back on those 30 years, like I said, Mammy died, but now you seem to care. This is the work ahead of us. This is the work of the remarkable scholars that have come together for this year's Lemon Project Symposium to share with you. The bits and pieces that I've shared, they will dig deep with you. You will hear more, you will learn more, and you will be inspired. And with that, I want you to say it with me. Mammy died, and I cared. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And again, thank you so much to William and Mary, to Jody Allen, Dr. Jody Allen, Dr. Catherine Rowe, and the entire group of presenters and participants for this year's symposium. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Christy Coleman, Dr. Christy Coleman. I like saying that. I appreciate you so much, and I am so glad that you're here to open our symposium formally for us, and to give us so much to think about. And I want to say it now. Mammy died, and I do care. And I think that's so important. We have to care. We have to remember all of those women, because if they had not stayed the course, we would not be here. So I appreciate them. And one of the things that you said early on was that being an interpreter helped you to feel the pain of your community. And I'm wondering if you can, what advice, because I know that some of the people watching tonight are interpreters. And I'm wondering, because I think that pain is still there. And I think sometimes, in particular, African-American female interpreters are still under the same kind of scrutiny that you were under. And I'm wondering what advice you might give to interpreters today.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have shared with especially young interpreters and museum professionals that come to me that often feel like they're in isolated space or they don't have the support is I encourage them to build support systems in their field, because there are, I will tell you, there are other young Black women who are doing this work, and some burn out very quickly because they don't understand where those mutual care sister girl kind of support is built, and you may find it within your institution, but more than likely you will find it outside of your institution. And so, it takes sometimes just that one person to reach out. I know that, when I go to conferences and things, especially sort of the local ones where you're more likely to see interpreters, and sometimes they aren't there, but sometimes they are. I make a point to just reach out to them and say, hey, how are you doing? What do you need? Here's somebody you might want to know or have a contact with. But it's that kind of thing, because it can be very, very isolating, especially at predominantly white institutions. But again, the need is mutual. And so the solution, I think, is mutual. You just have to reach out and you have to say it. I will say that the benefit that I had at 17 doing that work is that there was a group of people who were doing the same work. There weren't a lot of us. I think maybe there were 10 of men and women, and they were all older than me, but that was okay, because we looked out for each other. We found moments of levity. We found moments to talk about the best way to approach those insensitive, whether knowingly or unintentionally, those microaggressions that you deal with from colleagues, and or those immediate aggressions that you would deal with sometimes from insensitive visitors who think it's a game. But that's what I would say first, is find others that are doing that work and form your coalitions of support, because they are definitely out there. And one of the first places that I would say to look is the Association of African American Museums.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and our next question is, how do we bring lasting change to the narratives that have been constructed about Black women, from the strong Black woman down to Jezebel, narratives that are killing us each day?
Right. I wish I had the answer to that, but I think it does come with greater scholarship and exploration of how these things come to be. The strength comes from familial, right? I mean, we are taught to be that anchor, to be that point of strength, oftentimes in our families. And, the interesting thing about American culture in general and its treatment of African Americans, I think probably one of the most brilliant things I ever saw, and this was years ago, was Marlon Riggs' documentary, Ethnic Notions. And it explored the three big stereotypes of Black women and Black men, both in enslavement, but most of these stereotypes come about outside of slavery. When they can no longer control the Black body, they have to create myths around it to seek that control again. And so they have been enduring, and systems have been built around this. And so not only Black women as sort of this caring, strong woman and or mammy figure, but also the dimwit. And you're right, yes, the Jezebel. And so how do we break that down? We break down why white people needed that in order to move forward. And I know that sounds strange, but for some bizarre psychological reason, they needed it. They needed to believe that slavery was a benign system to deal with the moral failures of it. And it is no excuse even today. And you will hear people say, well, every society has enslaved people at one time or another, right? We've heard that. This was the first race-based system, global system in the world that displaced at least 10 to 15 million people. It was unlike anything else in the history of mankind, and we need to acknowledge that. And why was that? And again, the mythologies that raised up around that. When I tell visitors and they say, well, they were basically just hunters and gatherers in Africa, right? Like, well, no. I mean, there are whole cities and civilizations and, monuments. And I'm not just talking, I'm not talking Egypt. I'm talking Central West African cities. But you were never shown that. You were never shown those images from the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, as Europeans who were trading with these Africans were astonished at the complexity of these societies. But the lie needed to say they're uncivilized, right? And so, these are the things that we have to continue to work towards. You got to unmute yourself, Jody.
Oh, okay. So this next question is from a student.
Okay.
Says a student in the community laboratory studying William and Mary's Highland. Do you see a place for historical houses / former plantations like Highland fitting into William and Mary's reckoning with its past and the nation's reckoning? How do we balance the importance of actual physical places and markers of history when they also represent and bring up trauma?
That's a great question. I think when those places and those spaces are acknowledging those dichotomies. We first saw the success of this with Dorothy Sproul Redford in North Carolina at Somerset Place. This was her ancestral home, a plantation where her ancestors had been enslaved. And Dorothy went down there and flipped the script back in the 80s, I think it was. And, it was a story told from the lives of those enslaved people in ways that visitors had never seen before. But it was also a celebration of cultural amalgamation among these Africans who were finding, this idea of making a way out of no way. That is a standard African-American mantra, make a way out of no way. And Dorothy did this extraordinary job down there. We also see the Whitney Plantation, which is a memorial as well to the enslaved, and recognizing that these plantations and farms were death and work camps. The language that is used for that is really quite remarkable, and they've done, again, an extraordinary job. And there are lots of sites that are doing this. The challenge for those sites often is when there is this attempt at separation of the material culture from the architectural history, from the white ruling class or landowner history, that somehow all of these things are separate. They are not. They are intricately intertwined. And so when the stories are told that way, and we stop thinking about the stories of enslavement as exterior outbuildings only, or stories that you talk about when you're out on the grounds, instead of recognizing that slavery is in every fiber of those buildings, that's when I think that the stories can become richer and you find that narrative that you're seeking.
Okay. So as grade school students return to Jamestown settlement field trips, will they begin to hear more of the history that includes slavery?
The answer to that is yes. As you probably know, I have been at Jamestown now a little over a year. We recently opened back up to the public in June after being shut down like a lot of places, mid-March through the end of June. So we are, and actually during that period of disruption, we have spent a lot of time as the team talking about what our strategic goals and initiatives are going to be moving forward, and where we need to invest to make that happen. And so the staff has identified 3 key areas, and we are working towards that end. And yes, but right now, as I said, physically right now, one of the challenges that we have at the Jamestown settlement site anyway, is that we've got sort of an askewed timeline. The ships are on one kind of timeline. The fort is on another timeline, but physically not quite what it would have looked like in that timeline. And then we have Paspahegh, which is a partial reconstruction of the Powhatan, one of the townships of the Powhatan Alliance. And so there's work to be done there. So we are identifying all of these areas, again, to give us a stronger and a more complete narrative. And as you know, the first Africans that are brought to Jamestown in 1619, again, after that stop at Old Point Comfort and Hampton, there's a handful of folks that are brought to Jamestown proper. The others are distributed at those land granted plantations around. So we're trying to figure out what is it that we, okay, well, let me put it this way. We also, all of this is already discussed in great detail in our galleries. The challenge for us now is figuring out how do we make that ever present and appropriately present in our recreated areas. So stay with us. This is not something you turn like in a year.
Right.
It is definitely takes planning and aligning with making sure that we have all of the most recent scholarship, not to slow us down, but to make sure that we are where we need to be.
So this next question, what is the role of public history, or specifically museums, in terms of correcting narratives and ensuring that we don't let history repeat itself? What value does public history offer?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. And so there are variations on this theme. The first time I heard this was a colleague at Columbia University talked about it, and it made a heck of a lot of sense to me. And I was like, yeah, but if you add this, then you begin to understand. And the Sites of Conscience, which is a collaboration of museums around the world that are active in this idea of social responsibility. That's why they're called Sites of Conscience. But they have like a 5-tier system. I'm just going to share with you a 3-tier system of what public history does and what we have the power to do in helping to shift it. So in brief, there is the historical. That is the forensic facts. That is the archaeology. That is the written record. That is the confirmed and or collaborated oral histories. That is all of those social sciences, as well as physical sciences, because DNA has revealed a heck of a lot more for us in the historic field to tying pieces together. So there is history. That's what we call history, okay? And then there's this thing called heritage. And that's what most of us labor under. Heritage are the convenient stories that we have chosen to tell ourselves, right? For community cohesion. And more often than not, that community cohesion for most of our nation's history has been around white people being cohesive, with people of color being sort of on the fringes. And if they can't kind of get with that heritage storytelling, then we're kind of kept out of the mix. And unfortunately, museums are also, many museums emerge during this heritage time, okay? And then last but not least, there is the memory, the importance of memory. And memory is a powerful tool, both in terms of that forensic history, as well as the heritage making. The problem with memory is it's very individualized. And the problem with memory is more often than not, it has already been filtered by the time it comes out of your mouth. But we all have memories. For example, if I were to ask you, tell me about your experience on September 11th, 2001, you could probably give me extraordinary detail. But you've now filtered that detail because it's been 20 years later. You've filtered those details by additional knowledge you may have gained or some truths that you reject. Now, if I were to build a museum around your memory, it is flawed. If I were to simply build a museum around all the heritage that we have decided to say, things like, Iraq was behind it, they had weapons of mass destruction, it was all a part of it, when we really know forensically that the Saudis, with help from the Libyans, with help from, you see what I'm saying? and why they picked 9/11. But if we pull that forensic away, we're just left with this heritage making that has just come from all of these memories and people's different needs, right? So a museum, the good ones, recognize this triumvirate. And so our goal is to create new memories in our space for our guests that is well informed by the forensic, so that people then begin to build new heritage seeking that is more aligned with that. That is where museums can be really successful. But if they are about heritage keeping, that's a different problem and isn't likely to bring about the substantive change we're talking about.
Okay. Thank you. So this is we have time for one more question.
Okay.
It says, history is so important, yet our country continues to teach an inaccurate, whitewashed history outside of college and university classes. When does the teaching of America's true history begin in primary and secondary education?
I think it begins with the partnerships between museums and the academic community. Academics, I love them dearly, but they write for each other. Mm-hmm. And so when we find ways to help academics actually be in the public sphere, frankly, that's one of the reasons why I really love Twitter. There are some academics on Twitter who light it up. I mean, I'm telling you, it's a remarkable thing, and they're bringing such depth into the public discourse. I don't think we have enough of the academic community in public discourse where this is taking place, right? Instead, what we have is people who are quite savvy, who have been doing a lot of self-curated content without the discipline that academics have been trained to understand. And so they are creating their own narratives, and they're creating things like, you know, buzzwords like cancel culture and nonsense like that, right? So that's, for me, that's where it comes from. I think if we can find ways to really engage our academics in public discourse, you know, and not everybody can do that. There are some people that, you know, they're best just kind of digging through those archives. But then there are others who I think who have powerful voices, and showing them and helping them how to use that, whether museums serve as that sort of intermediary space, which I love to do that actually, to provide those spaces for academics to shine. But again, it's this idea of bringing everybody, you know, into the public sphere, because the work is there. You know, the stuff that we're talking about right now, academics have been working on this for decades. But it hasn't reached the public in the way that it could have. And so it feels like a culture war. And that's only because it's beginning, that work is beginning to trickle out rather than being deliberately placed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again. I think that was the last question, right, Jody?
That sadly is the last question, because it's 7:29, so we have a minute. I just want to, you know, again, thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure I speak with 100 or so people who were here this evening, that in terms of our gratitude for your taking the time to share your amazing mind with us and your work. And I really appreciate it. And thank you on behalf of the Lemon Project. I want to invite those of you who are here tonight to please join us the rest of the week and into the weekend for the rest of our symposium. We've had a wonderful start today. And I promise it will only get better if you can imagine it. Okay. Thank you again, and have a great evening, everybody.